been a number of discussions of the history of Belmont. I actually think it's pretty simple. So I'll tell the story as I know it. First of all, it's a commission document, and that's very important to bear in mind. There's nobody's name on the document that says X or X, Y, and Z wrote it. And it is most definitely a commission document, and I'll explain what the process was for that attribution. There was, first of all, the Belmont Retreat. I was not at the Belmont Retreat because I hadn't yet joined the staff. And it's quite clear that a number of people made significant contributions to the discussion there. Karen Labax, who was a commissioner, is clearly one. Charles Freed, who was a visitor, was one. I won't go on. The commissioners were pretty much all there, and the staff, such as it was at the time, was all there, and they engaged in this discussion. And it was actually decided at that time what the three principles were, right? Respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. For better or for worse, it was decided at that time. But there was no analysis of the principles. There was a discussion about why these three principles and whether they would do the work that needed to be done. Now, at the time, the work that needed to be done, in part, was to have principles so that the commissioners could talk to one another. You might say, that's ridiculous. Why don't you just talk? But there were professional background difficulties. To mention just one, Joe Brady was a behaviorist psychologist. And the idea of the kind of normative language that was being used and some of the psychological language that was being used, he didn't understand it. It had to be more or less translated to him as to what was meant. And then finally he'd say, oh, you mean so-and-so. And then he would express it in his behaviorist psychology language. And we would go on. So you had blocks like that, blocks between the lawyers and the philosophers, and we had two people in religious ethics who were on the commission, and so on. So that had to be overcome, and it clearly was not overcome completely at the Belmont Retreat. But things got sort of solidified there. Basically, we knew, well, you got to be careful about this too, that you don't rewrite history. We knew there had to be the principles because that was mandated by the legislation, and we knew there had to be a discussion of the boundaries between research and practice because that was part of the legislation. So by the end of the Belmont Retreat, it was known what the group thought the principles would be, and that never went away, actually, in title and name. And we knew that there had to be something on boundaries, but boundaries was not principles. So you got, so to speak, a division, and you could see that in the final product of the Belmont Report. That actually is the direct legacy of Congress. Congress mandated, basically, that the National Commission would decide about matters of boundaries and would decide about matters of the principles. Now, the reason they wanted, you might say, why do you need boundaries? Why don't you just have principles? Because it's supposed to be an ethics document, and these are the moral principles. What does boundaries have to do with it? And the explanation of that is also, I think, fairly simple and very interesting. This was a political decision to have a boundaries section. Why? Because you could regulate research, and it seemed apparent that there was going to have to be regulation because of the history of scandals, whether you go all the way back to Nuremberg, which I don't think is really quite the proper dating, or you just take these more immediate scandals like Tuskegee. There was a general conviction that science, meaning research, had to be regulated, right? But practice, right? Now you're talking something that's really politically sensitive, and it was never in question, so far as Congress was concerned, that practice would be regulated. So you had to draw the boundaries. Why did you have to draw the boundaries? Because you have to know what you're going to regulate, right? You can't regulate practice, so you have to know what it is that you're regulating, namely what research is. So that's the background of it. Anyway, this is mandated more or less by the Congress that the National Commission proceed in this way, and it did. It was faithful to the congressional mandate. So I get appointed to the staff. And then I get designated by Michael Yesley, the director, as the person in charge of the Belmont document. He says, got to have a section on boundaries. At that time, envisaged as a late section. It later got put first, largely by a decision of Ken Ryan, if I'm remembering correctly. In any event, I'm to concentrate principally on the principles, because there had already been a fairly aggressive and active discussion on boundaries, and a lot of that was reasonably well settled. I just had to be sure it would fit in with the rest of what I write about principles. And so I remember a discussion I had in front of the men's room on West Bard Avenue in a hallway, and we were talking about, what are these principles? What do these principles mean, these principles coming out of Belmont? And Yesley said to me, well, Tom, I think that's pretty much up for you to tell us what they mean. That's your job. Right? So then he said something like, there's a file that we've assembled. I think he meant Barbara Mishkin assembled. There's a file we've assembled of all the past discussions and materials on Belmont, and we'll give you that file. And he said, but I don't think you're going to find a lot in it that's going to answer your question about principles. Right? So he gives me this file of 50 pages. And I may be oversimplifying. Somebody like Al Johnson might say I'm oversimplifying here, but this is my lasting impression. The boundaries section, which had been originally crafted for the commission by Bob Levine, but then highly stylized and simplified and condensed down to about 4 pages, was in great shape. This commission had spent a lot of time deliberating on it. Bob had written and rewritten and so on. That was really good. So that's 4 of the 50 pages I was given. The other 46 pages have virtually nothing to do with principles. It was stuff like copies of the Nuremberg Code, copies of the legislation that created the commission. It was, stuff like that. So over the course of the next 6 months, as we had meetings every month, the National Commission. So over the course of the next 6 months, I got rid of all the other 46 pages. They were all gone. That's documentable, by the way, because we have on record each of the month's books, and you can see the pages progressively disappearing from the copies of what was given to the commissioners as the materials on the Belmont Report. So I wrote all this stuff about principles, and you might say, okay, so then you're the author of everything except the boundaries section, which was Bob Levine, as then discussed by the commission and reduced down. Well, yes, but the thing not to forget is what I mentioned at the beginning. This is a commission document. And so it's a process. It was not just me writing it and the commission saying, oh, that's good. It wasn't like that at all. I would write something, and we would go in and discuss it, and then it would get the stuffing knocked out of it. I'll give you an example of this. Commissioner Donald Selden, who became a very close friend of mine, wanted a very philosophical piece of work. So he wanted there to be a mention of the importance of people like Immanuel Kant and why that would be important for respect for persons, and John Stuart Mill, and why that would be important for the principle of beneficence. But he's absolutely right about this. So I wrote up various things sort of like this to sort of satisfy Selden, and then it goes to the National Commission. They say, what's all this stuff from Kant and Mill? And so we don't want that. This is a public document that enunciates principles that everybody can read. So, that stuff's all gone. So this is not my determination. First of all, that Mill or Kant went in the first place. That was the request of the commissioner. And then when it flew out, that was the request of the other commissioners. So the document really has to be understood as written in that form. You had to be responsive to the commissioners. Moreover, they didn't always come directly to me. They would often go to Barbara Mishkin, because Barbara had served, so to speak, as the spokesperson in the past. She was on their Rolodex. We literally all had Rolodexes in those days. She's on their Rolodex, and they would call Barbara, and then Barbara would say, here's what Commissioner so-and-so wants. Here's what Pat King called me. Pat was my colleague and friend, right? So we called Barbara because Barbara's on the Rolodex. And Pat would give certain suggestions, and then Barbara would pass those along to me. That's really how the document was written. So in the end, when it said it is the document of the National Commission, it is. It is the document of the deliberative work of the National Commission.